Our next session is on historical and cultural studies and media. The chair was supposed to be Yianni Cartledge, but he has family emergency, so he's presenting from home. So I'll step in as a chair for this session whilst Yianni presents from home. Yianni, you may start.
Oh, thanks, Francis. Can you hear me? Okay?
Yeah, loud and clear.
And is my slide show all good up there?
Yes.
Excellent. Thanks, Francis. I'm really sorry I couldn't be there in person to do this, guys, and to chair the session. So appreciate Francis stepping in to be chair and for the flexibility with teams. So hope it's been a great conference so far today. I'm going to be talking about Aegean Islander migration to the Anglosphere between 1815 and 1945. This is pretty much a summary of my thesis. So I submitted in December last year and was finally conferred in March this year. So this is kind of the outcomes, a very brief, I guess, 10-minute overview of the outcomes of my thesis. When we talk about Aegean Islanders, I'm talking about this region here, the Aegean Sea, specifically the North Aegean Sea, and you can see the islands there in orange. So these are Greek islands with majority Greek-speaking populations. My thesis sort of gave a general overview of the islands, but there was two specific case studies that I focused on. These were from Chios, and you can see Chios is an island there quite close to the Turkish coast, and just below Chios you can see Ikaria. So they were the two islands of my case studies. So geographically from a very similar place, but they migrated to different places in different contexts, and that was essentially what I was tracing through my thesis. So let's go next slide. So thinking about this, just kind of talking about what spurred on my research. You can see these gum trees here. In front of this is the Gronthos family home in Neia in Ikaria. It's a very small village on the northern side of Ikaria. It's actually my grandfather's village. But something I noticed there were these gum trees that were overhanging the house. The story goes that these gum trees were planted by an ancestor that had come to Australia in the early 20th century and had returned with gum tree seeds as a kind of commemoration to his visit in Australia. How true this story is, we're not sure. They could have been spread here another way, but this is kind of what spurred on my interest in this early migration between Australia, United Kingdom and the Aegean Islands. So the project explored Aegean Islander migration to the English-speaking world, and this was my rough kind of time frame, 1815 to 1945. It was a very broad period, sort of capped by the end of the Napoleonic Wars and the end of World War II. So this kind of big, very broad period in European global history. The period was chosen, though, more due to it being an under-researched time frame, especially in comparison to the post-World War II migration boom. So really not a lot was said about this earlier period. The key facets that I looked at specifically with these migrants were their immigration, so the way they left, their settlement in their new countries, the way they built communities, and their integration into society. And part of that was a key, I guess, idea of identity. So the two case studies I chose to really focus or hone in on were Greeks from the island of Chios, who migrated to London between 1815 and 1900, and Greeks from the island of Ikaria, who migrated to South Australia 1900 to 1945. So both sort of at two ends of this kind of period. So I'm going to quickly talk about both case studies very briefly, and then have a look at the kind of the findings around them. So the Chiots of London, so Greek islanders from the island of Chios. So they emigrated to London from their island in 2 migrations. So firstly, there was a very short economic migration, 1815 to 1822, and this was followed with a coerced migration due to a large massacre on the island in 1822. So this massacre actually was carried out by, firstly, Greek revolutionaries, and then secondly by the Ottoman Empire. And 100,000 islanders from Chios were actually murdered or displaced or enslaved due to the massacre. So those that survived, especially of the wealthier merchant class, decided to emigrate. Speaking of the economic migration, firstly, most of those that came before the massacre in 1822 were merchants that were settling in London. So these islanders, they settled around the busy kind of business district of Finsbury Circus. They ran merchant firms in this area. They were became quite affluent quite quickly. But all the new arrivals coming, especially post-massacre, were arriving and settling around Finsbury Circus. And then from there, they kind of built community. So they started building churches. They formed like a brotherhood, or a kind of a Greek organisation. They called them a brotherhood. And they kept proliferating family merchant firms as well. You can see the Greek Church of Our Saviour here. This was at 82 London Wall. This is one of the earliest churches. It's not the first in London, but it's one of the earliest Greek churches there. But this was kind of the centre of their community, and it was built, I believe it was built in the 1840s, this church. Following this, I looked at their integration and how they became part of British society. Really looked at this idea of the cultivated elite. So these were merchants, even though they were refugees, many of them, they were from a merchant class. They were very affluent, and they did blend in very well to kind of British society, especially British Empire. And their story later on is that their community does spread to other parts of the British Empire. India in particular is where they do set up a lot of firms, merchant firms from there. But yeah, they did also at the same time maintain their Chiot identity. In comparison, I looked at also the Ikarians of South Australia from the island of Ikaria. They came in a very different kind of context to the Chiots. So the first, they were mostly an economic migration of male labourers. Chiots were, I guess, families coming, but these were mainly male labourers at first. But there were families coming afterwards in the 1930s. They settled around Port Pirie and then the Adelaide CBD. This was linked to where the work was. Port Pirie had the BHP smelters, and this is where the majority of Ikarians first settled. And you can see the photo here with Ikarian smelter workers. This photo is debated whether it was taken in Port Pirie or Kandos, but those that were in New South Wales had been working previously in Port Pirie, so we're not sure exactly where this photo specifically was taken, but these same men were in both locations during the 1910s. The Ikarians similarly built community. They linked with the existing Greek community in Port Pirie. However, they weren't as focused as being Ikarian specific. They did kind of join into the broader Greek community in South Australia. They didn't actually organise their own brotherhood until after the scope of the studies. That's 1958, when they became a brotherhood, where the Chiots formed their own brotherhood within the first decade of being in London. The Ikarians ultimately became part of South Australian society, but they remained linked to their Ikarian and Greek heritage, and there was a different reception. So where the Chiots became part of this imperial system, being merchants, the Ikarians were on the receiving end of anti-Greek riots and questions of whiteness due to the White Australia policy as well. So a bit briefly on the comparison, the main differences we see here were that the class of migrants, we had the merchant class migrating versus the working class. there were also family units were different. So Ikarians were labouring males, single males often at first, and families came later, where the Chiots were migrating just as families. And also there's this practice of endogamy, or marrying within their own families or own family kind of kinship groups, where the Chiots in London maintained this probably due to maintaining wealth as well. The Ikarians tended to marry outside their kinship groups a little bit more regularly. There's also the idea of coerced versus free or economic migrations that played into this. Most of the Chiots were refugees, whereas most of the Ikarians, even though there was an element of coercion through economic migration, they were free migrants and weren't displaced in any sense. There was also the reliance on community when settling, and this was the big key similarity between the two groups. They both relied on the existing community to help them settle. When arriving, both groups would go to the community, and the community would be that centre of providing employment, housings, and keeping them, I guess, linked with other Greek speakers. They also navigated different policies. Britain had a more open door policy to migration in this period, with some restrictions, but whereas Australia had much harsher immigration restriction, which often questioned who was coming, why they were coming, and there's a lot more cases of deportation in the Australian context as well. They did, though, all follow this same model of founding community centres, building churches, brotherhoods, having also unofficial meeting places. I haven't talked about a lot today, but clubs and cafes became centres of community as well. And just a little bit more on this, there was a different integration. So where the Chiots became part of that elite imperial kind of class, the Ikarians became more linked to the working class and eventually to war service as well. And there's a good photo here of Port Pirie's Greeks celebrating the end of World War I. Their identities, though, became pluralised. Chiots or Ikarians, they both maintained their local islander identities. They also had their Greek identity, but they also adopted their new British and Australian identities. These became eventually hybrid identities. So I argue that they became British Chiots or Ikarian Australians, which I think fits in with a diasporic identity here. But they also had a nostalgic identity. So their children and grandchildren maintained an identity for a homeland beyond where they were living as well. And essentially, despite the different contexts, they did follow similar patterns of community building, integration, and identity maintenance. So hey, Francis.
Yeah, so we ran into a technical issue. Machine went off. Can you please run up for us? In 1 minute.
Yeah, let me just get back to the slides. Sorry about that. Where did it go offline? Francis, was it around here?
Yes. Yeah, here.
All right, yeah, just I guess to round off the talk. So this was a linking factor. I'm not sure if you'd heard me chat about this. This man here with the dog on his lap, he's kind of someone I discovered along the way. All four of his grandparents were refugees from Chios. He ended up being born in Britain, and then he migrated to South Australia, coming in very different context to the labouring islanders coming at the same time. He ended up purchasing 15,000 plus acres outside of Balaclava. So he became a landowner and didn't fit into that Greek diaspora community that was existing here. So this is just, I guess, an illustration of the class dynamic between these two groups. Despite their similar geographic locations, there's kind of very different stories that emerge from them. So yeah, thanks for listening, guys, and apologies about the difficulties there.
Give me a sec. Please, Yianni wants to go back to his emergency, so if there is any question for him before he leaves. All right. Congratulations, Yianni. Yeah, so thank you.
Dr. Yianni.
Oh, he's got it. Yeah, so Dr. Yianni, congrats on your graduation and all the best.
All right, thanks, guys, and thanks for having me online. I know it's not ideal, but yeah, hope the rest of the conference goes well, guys.